Testing, testing. Welcome to the Introduction of Evolution lecture. Today we're going to talk about just the basics of evolution and a couple of theories of evolution. But before we begin, we're going to start with just a couple of questions here. What accounts for the diversity of life? These are just questions that I want you to think about today during our lecture. What causes the diversity of life? What is evolution? Who is Charles Darwin and what did he do? And what does survival of the fittest mean? You should be able to answer these by the time we're done with this lecture. You should have already completed the Hostile Planet Mountains questions in our Canvas page for today, so please make sure you've done that first before we move on, because I will be referencing that. So we're going to start off today with just thinking about different organisms and trying to determine why they are that way. So we're going to look at some pictures and I'm going to give you some clues, and I want you to think to yourself why you think these organisms evolved to look the way that they do now. So here's the first one. Canis domesticus. Couple of facts. Wild canines rarely bark, but house dogs do it constantly. There are different kinds of identifiable barks between different breeds. And our clue is the alarm bark sounds virtually identical all across all dog breeds. So why is it that over time wild canines don't bark but house dogs do? Give you a couple seconds. So for 50,000 years we've been breeding wolves for their ability to communicate danger to humans. Other barks serve to solidify the interspecies communication bond. And so what this means is over time, we bred wolves in order for them to communicate to us that danger is coming. And so wild wolves became companions to humans back 50,000 years ago. And whenever danger would come, they would communicate that danger by doing an alarm bark. And so as the species evolved over time, we ended up having our house dogs that have been bred for our houses to have similar alarm barks to tell us when there is danger around. Here's the next one here. Polyrhacus behemata. They have this double fishhook projection on the back of their backs. Why do you think they have this fishhook projection? Where did they get this from? And I'll give you a clue. They are a colonial or hive species, so they live within a hive. I'm going to give you a couple seconds to think. Why would this ant-looking creature have a double hook on its back? So, when they are attacked, they sacrifice themselves for the sake of the colony. And so they sting and bite and have their hooks attached to the attacker. If you attack at the nest, the entire colony assembles this great pile, each connecting each other's with their hooks to defend the interior where the queen is located. And so each of the individual ants will end up having this hook connect to one another so that they can protect. Here is our next one, Babiana ringens. They have a modified woody sepal extending vertically behind the flowers. And so this is a plant. Here are the flowers. This is a fleshy plant, but they end up with this woody stick-like structure called a sepal that extends vertically behind the flowers. I'll let you know that plants without it produce fewer seeds, and the plant grows very close to the ground. So why would they end up creating this woody sepal here? So this woody sepal is actually there to help with pollination and allow the seeds to be fully dispersed. So you can see here that this bird here can attach to the woody sepal. It has enough structure there that they can land on it and eat out of the nectar so they can take pollen or seeds to other locations so that they can reproduce. Next, narwhal. This is a modified spiraling of the left tooth. They are fleshy and very sensitive on the outside and hard on the inside. They can bend up to 1 foot in either direction, and only about 15% of females have them and 95% of males have them. So why do narwhals have this spike here? So nobody really knows. They're probably involved in mating rituals or communications or as a sensory organ. They're not used to break ice, they're not used aggressively to catch prey or to attack other animals, but they believe that it might just be for some type of mating ritual or communication between the two different organisms. So with that, we know that animals adapt over time to their environment, which is not the organism choosing to have better fitness or choosing to have certain adaptations, but when adaptations arrive in the population, if it's advantageous, they survive and they're able to pass on their genes to their offspring. And so this is a quote from Charles Darwin. "It is not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one that's most responsive to change." And so as our environment changes, as our population changes, the ones that survive, or is most fit to survive, are going to be the species that's most responsive to that change. It doesn't matter how strong you are, it doesn't matter how fit you are or how intelligent you are, it has to do with the response to change. And so today we're going to start talking about evolution. What is evolution? Evolution is the change in gene frequency within a population over time. So this isn't us talking about a creation story. This is not us talking about Big Bang. This is talking about how organisms and their genes change in a population over time. So what is changing within these populations over time? It is a process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms, and the result is from a change in the alleles of that organism that can be passed down from one generation to the next. And so you can see there is a change within organisms over time. These are thousands and thousands of years ago, but over time you can see a change, and that change in those genes over time is what we term evolution. But evolution is a theory, and so we do need to talk about the difference between theory and fact. Okay? Theory is a well-supported, testable explanation of natural events, supported by evidence that can be tested with new evidence. And so these are things that are supported with different evidence and has been tested, but we can't state it as a fact because theories can change. So you can see here the theory of gravity. We know that gravity is obviously true. If I were to drop a ball, it'd end up hitting the ground because there is gravity around, and that's something that is testable that we can test over time. So there are different theories of evolution, how evolution occurs. And so we're going to talk about two major scientists in our next little section here to talk about the different theories of evolution based on their individual theories. The first person we're going to talk about is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who had the theory of inheritance of acquired traits. And the second person we're going to talk about is Charles Darwin, who has a theory of evolution by natural selection. So Lamarck's theory, he termed in 1809, he says that by selective use or disuse of certain traits, organisms will gain or lose certain traits during their lifetime. These traits could then be passed on to their offspring. So an example of this is Lamarck would say a giraffe would gain a long neck by stretching it for food. So since this giraffe is continuing to stretch its neck upward to reach those leaves, over time you'd end up having organisms with longer necks because he's using that certain trait in order to get it. And so he believes that that trait was acquired because they ended up using it. Or it could be the opposite. They didn't use it, so they lost the trait, right? So here we have the giraffe here. He's eating off the bush. He's not going to end up getting the trait of a longer neck because he's not using that trait in order to get it. And so here's the original short-necked ancestor of giraffes, and over time he noticed that they end up with long necks, and he believes that because they kept reaching their neck higher and higher up on the tree and stretching their neck over and over, you end up with organisms in the population over time with a longer neck. So he also believes that there is the inheritance of those acquired traits. So traits that were acquired during one's lifetime can be then passed down to offspring. And so an example that supports that theory is that dogs, whenever you clip their ears, so clipping of an ears would mean that this original dog, if you clipped it, they would ending up with floppy ears for the organism. They're saying that that could be passed down to the offspring. So the offspring wouldn't need its ears clipped because they're already floppy ears. And so this is his theory of inheritance of acquired traits. Now, here is the second theory of evolution by Charles Darwin. And he has a theory of evolution by natural selection. This is a scientist that contributed most to our understanding of evolution. You probably have heard his name. He's very popular. He made observations and collected evidence while he was studying species on the Galapagos Islands, and he noticed that many plants and animals were well suited for their environment. So what did he do? He went to the islands west of South Africa that are super close together but have very different climates, called the Galapagos Islands. And so these islands, it looks like this. They all have different environments. So they might have one island with rocky shores, but one has lots of vegetation, things like that. And he studied two different organisms mainly. He studied the shell shape of many tortoises. So he looked at the shapes of shells of tortoises. And he also looked at the beak shape of different finches, this specific type of bird here. He wondered if the animals on all the different islands once came from the same species or common ancestry. And so he's trying to say, hey, did all of these finches come from one original finch and over time they ended up with different beaks? Or were they all just individual species to begin with? And so he noticed that similar species were each well suited to their environment that they inhabited. The traits of the similar species very noticeably among different islands of the Galapagos, and he hypothesized that the animals ended up adapting to those local conditions on the islands after their arrival. So his theory was that this finch ended up coming from Africa. It flew over the Galapagos Islands, and they ended up starting to procreate. Now, whichever island that they ended up landing on, the ones that are most adapted to that environment are going to be the ones that survived. And so as time went on, as mutations were introduced into the population, the adaptations that were best fit to survive ended up surviving on those islands. But he doesn't believe that many different bird species just came over from Africa. He believes that one species came over, and then over time, the mutations and changes in that species ended up showing different adaptations on different islands based on their being well suited. So evolution by natural selection states that over time, species that are best suited for their environment will survive and pass those beneficial traits to their offspring. And so once again, if there's a mutation that makes them more advantageous, then they're going to be more likely to pass that on to their offspring, and their offspring will have more ability to survive. This results in changes in inherited traits of a population, not an individual. So we're not talking about one individual changing. An example here were giraffes were born with different heights. The ones that had longer necks were more fit to survive and were able to get more food. And so they were able to pass on their longer necks to their offspring, while the giraffes with the shorter necks ended up not being able to pass on their traits because they ended up not surviving to get enough food. Darwin did write a book on natural selection in 1859. The book provided evidence that evolution has been taking place, and he stated that species vary from one to another in nature and in form. And so he also identified two different types of selection: artificial selection, which is selective breeding, and natural selection, which is the mechanism of evolution that we've been talking about. So I want you to think about these questions before we move on to our tasks tomorrow. So first, according to Lamarck, how do organisms acquire their traits? So specifically Lamarck, I'm not talking about Darwin, looking at Lamarck's theory and what he believes. How do organisms acquire their traits? Does evolution happen to individuals or populations? So it just happens to one, or does it happen to the whole population? And then is there evidence to support Lamarck's theory, and is there evidence to support Darwin's theory? Those are the questions I want you to think about from today's lecture.